Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à Montréal. Avec cette introduction, je pense que je puisse vous dire que c'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui. And I just wanted to make sure we got you accustomed to speaking in French in Montreal because, that's the way we are, and we are fluently bilingual for the most part. And one of the topics that I wanted to talk about today was really about aviation and trying to understand what's going on in terms of Canadian rights and Canadian aviation practices. So it really is talking about a brief history of air passenger rights in Canada, talking about what the new regime is going to look like, talk about air passenger rights as compared to other jurisdictions, and I'm going to focus in on our friends in the European Union, talk a bit about that, and we'll talk about what's needed for you in terms of having your clients understand the Bill of Rights and understand what to do if they in fact do get affected by disruption. So just to give you a bit of background onto what rights are all about, anybody in this room ever get bumped from an airplane in the last year, let's say? Hands up, anybody? Did you enjoy the experience? Yes, no? You loved it? Probably not. So it's not really something that people enjoy going through. There's a lot of stress when you come to the check-in counter and you go and you get your boarding pass and it says gate. It says GTE or gate on the boarding pass. It doesn't give you a seat number. That's your first clue. We have a problem. You have, the odds are you haven't got a seat that they can give you at the point of check-in. So when that happens, people's blood pressure goes up, people's heart rate starts to race because people tend to know that they really want their seat and they want their seat ahead of time. So when you check in electronically or you check in physically and you see GTE on your boarding pass, that's the first sign that you may be in for a conversation when you're at the airport. Doesn't mean you may not get a seat, but you're going to be in a situation where your seat may be called upon in question. So that scenario, basically, over the years, has resulted in a number of aeronautical authorities around the world trying to figure out how do you handle those situations and how do you put some rigor into the process of making sure people understand liability and the liability of the airlines. Now, the liability issue with the airline industry goes back many years, even before we started flying commercially in Canada. And in the Warsaw Convention in 1929, we had regulations and liability limits being put in place when it talks about aircraft that basically did not finish their journey and you suffered loss of life and loss of baggage. So that was the first set of regulations and liabilities that was put in place and signed by a number of aeronautical authorities around the world. And that was the first set of responsibilities that the airlines had in terms of making sure there was some compensation for loss of life and loss of baggage, which is pretty interesting in terms of comparing that to today's world. It's a little different in terms of liability, but beyond the Warsaw Convention in 29, the Chicago Convention in 47 brought in ICAO and brought in a bunch of annexes that talked about how do you in fact manage the flow of international passengers around the world, because people were starting to fly long distances, flying intercontinental flights, long distance flights. So the Chicago Convention basically brought in some rules and regulations about that. And then the Montreal Convention in 1999 brought in some very, very specific responsibilities in terms of how do you go about compensating it for disruptions, for flight disruptions, for baggage losses, and making it very specific for the airline industry in terms of compensation that was due to passengers who were disrupted. So airlines have taken all of these rules and apply them into their tariffs. And has anybody ever seen one of these tariffs? You probably see these 100-page tomes that are around that have so much legal expertise around it that it's sometimes very difficult to really understand what it is. But in my previous life, when I joined Air Canada back in the 1970s, one of my roles was, in fact, the manager of passenger pricing prior to deregulation. And one of my roles was really trying to understand those tariffs and, in fact, recreate those tariffs to reflect the world of deregulation that Canada was going into in the early 80s. And some of those tariffs basically were something that I would basically require about a dozen lawyers in my offices once a week to basically go out there and start to create more and more legalese to try to make sure that the airlines were protected They really weren't there to protect the passenger. They were there to protect the airline industry. So when you read those tariffs, there's very little in those tariffs that relate to passengers. They really relate to the limit of liability that airlines have. And that's where it gets a little tricky in terms of trying to understand whose responsibility is it to compensate passengers. So over the last 15 to 20 years, a number of aeronautical organizations around the world, primarily the European Union and the US, have put together a number of regulations that try to bring to the forefront passenger protection and try to understand what passenger protection is all about. So when deregulation happened in Canada in the 80s, a number of agencies were brought on board to try to understand the evolution of passenger rights. So we had the National Transportation Agency created in 86. We had the Canadian Agency converted to the CTA in 1996, and we had Flight Rights Canada, which is a voluntary act, a voluntary set of regulations created in 2008, all of which were basically just consultative and not really binding the airlines to any fixed level of compensation, except denied boarding compensation. Back when, in the mid-'80s and late '80s, a lot of the airlines started to overbook flights. And that's when the industry decided to say, well, we have to have a minimum level of compensation. So they said $100 compensation or $200 in terms of vouchers. But we get you on the flight whenever we could get you on the flight. So that was the extent to which we basically had denied boarding compensation in the books. Now, fast forward to 2004, you have situations where European Union started to do something in 2004, the US in 2011, and in Canada, in 2018 and 2019, we now have a new regime. And the regime basically has very, very specific requirements of the airlines and very, very specific compensation levels that are going to be offered to the passengers who are affected by flight delays, flight cancellations, denied boarding, lost baggage, and all that good stuff that happens when we tend to fly these days. So in terms of the communication side of it, it really is something that the airlines really had to go out there and make it very specific as to the level of the communication that they have to provide passengers. You have to tell passengers about delays. You can't just sit there for hours and hours and hours in an airport terminal and not know what's going on. There's a requirement now in regulation to say every 30 minutes, you have to update the passengers as to the status of their flight. You also have to talk about delayed and canceled flights, looking at the provisions about how much do you, in fact, compensate passengers for delayed or canceled flights. Also about denied boarding, it's been refreshed to up the ante in terms of making it much more at competitive levels in the marketplace and what other agencies and other European Union and US rights have said in terms of denied boarding compensation. Tarmac delays, for those of you that remember Ottawa 2017 with Air Transat, it really was a way for the regulators at that point in time to react to that scenario and enact some regulations about how long do you have to stay or should you stay on an airplane, dispatched from the gate, sitting on the tarmac, waiting to go. How long should you be able to stay on that aircraft before the aircraft is brought back? And they've talked about some regulations and some compensation associated with that. And there's also some other ones with seating children together under the age of 14, lost or damaged bags, minor adjustment to say that now your baggage is going to be under a claim. You basically have the international regulations for baggage loss and damaged baggage now come into play rather than just a set of Canadian regulations. And then the transportation of musical instruments. So those of you that saw that video a couple of years ago about the United passenger who got his guitar or bass guitar kind of smashed up, again, a reaction by the regulators to say, whoops, we can't let that happen again. Let's go out there and put some regulations in place. So all of this kind of makes us more competitive, albeit to a regulation that's been around about 15 years. The European Union has regulations been in place since 2004 dealing with flight cancellations, flight delays, flight overbookings, denied boarding, and damage and lost baggage. Much more progressive, much more in light of a lot more consumer pressure in the EU about compensation. You had a number of airline disruptions, a number of airlines that went bust in the EU in the early 2000 periods. Passengers, by the thousands, were stranded across Europe. So the regulators and the government authorities said we have to do something to basically understand the level of compensation that our passengers get afforded as they go through some disruption. So what we're looking at, in terms of the regulations, the projection of the changes in rights that we have, Question's been raised by a couple of my buddies over in the Air Passenger Rights Group in Halifax. Mr. Lucas and company basically put together a couple of slides that kind of describe what's this new regulation all about, and how does it compare to what the regulations that are already in the books. So, the government basically has said we're coming up with a new set of regulations that, in quotation marks, are the best in the world. Well, Mr. Lucas kind of disagrees with that, and I just, for sake of balance, I'm going to talk about some of his perspectives. He's saying, under the existing regulations prior to July, there were regulations about the length of time an airline can keep you on an airplane before they in fact start to deplane you. And it used to be 90 minutes. Now it's 3 hours, extended to 3 hours and 45 minutes. So the regulations now are a little looser than they were, and that the compensation and the fines that airlines would pay as a result of keeping you on board these airplanes have changed somewhat. But, it used to be 90 minutes, now it's 3 hours and 45 minutes. So we're not sure whether that's better, same, worse, I'm not sure. But, we'll have to see how that regulation kind of plays out. There's flight delay and cancellations due to maintenance issues on board of airplanes. One of the things you have to be concerned about as looking at these regulations is that the airline industry has an out on these regulations. And it's really about the definition, who defines an airline cancellation, who defines an airline delay. And the way the regulations are set up, it is the airline that defines whether it is basically something within their control or something that's outside of their control. There's some definition, pretty loose definition in the regulations as far as I'm concerned, about what says is in your control and out of your control as an airline. But the airline can in fact talk about things like, we have a maintenance issue, we have a flight crew issue, and we have a safety issue, and that basically exempts us from paying any compensation as a result of a flight being delayed or flight being canceled. If there's one area where we're going to have a lot of debate over the next few years, next few months, next few years with these regulations, it's going to be on that one point. What do airlines basically have as their criteria for defining what's in their control and out of their control? And the only way we're going to get some clarity on that one, I think, is for people to start complaining about situations where they in fact have been disrupted and the airline saying, sorry, no compensation, it's out of our control. And that's where the debate's going to happen over the next few months and years about how much government oversight, how much regulatory oversight are you going to get now in the world of what does the airline really call for in terms of a delay within or outside of its control. And deny boarding compensation when the airline does not admit responsibility. There used to be compensation in the books that talks about either the $100 cash or $200 coupons. Now, the airlines can get away with saying, well, we had a scheduled cancellation, we had a flight that really came in a little late, so we were going to change airplanes, we're going to go from a 320 to a 319, and we've got 20 passengers who don't have seats. I'm sorry, no compensation because of the fact that your flight basically was changed as a result of a mechanical issue on an airplane. No compensation. So it gets to be really tricky in terms of how do you, in fact, airlines, again, decide what's within their control and outside of their control. So comparing what we're doing now in Canada with the EU, if the airline proves extraordinary circumstances, in the EU there's no compensation. There's some hotels that would be there for the extent of a delay is too long, but there's no dollar compensation. In Canada, there's no compensation either way, no hotels, no dollar compensation. Airlines claim outside of their control. Interestingly, in Europe, can't use that excuse anymore. If it's within your control or outside of your control, doesn't matter. You get compensation. And in Canada, of course, we have that out. The airline claims urgent maintenance, got an APU that's broken, got a wing slat that's broken, got to change the tires, whatever it is. In Europe, doesn't matter, you still pay. And in Canada, they have the out. Airline admits responsibility, fine, both of us basically, both Canada and the EU provide payment. And interestingly, in order for you to make a claim, in the EU, you have up to 6 years after the event to make your claim. In Canada, statutory, the new regulations, maximum of 120 days. So it really, and people are complaining about the fact that these regulations are too austere. much too onerous on the industry. I think that, you talk about lawsuits currently in place by the airline industry against Transport Canada in federal court about these regulations, and they're saying they're too onerous. Well, I think that the European model basically is giving you an idea that it's not really that onerous at all. And then the compensation side, check-in counters are closed. They can get away with it in Canada. They can't get away with that in Europe. And there's a number of other domains that really have the ability for your Canadian carriers to get out of their payment model. So if you've been affected, but one of your clients has been affected by disruption, a couple of rules to follow. Note all the announcements made by the airline carriers. It really is important that you take notes as to what's going on, and and keep track of the communication that you have with the airline in the event of a flight disruption. Approach staff courteously. Don't go in there and yell and scream and pound on tables. It doesn't usually work. But make sure you take the names of the individuals that you're talking to. Listen to the offers they make to remedy the situation, if any. Sometimes the airlines will try to get away without saying, well, sorry, it's out of our control. Okay, tell me why it's out of your control, and just note down the conversation and go through a process of making sure you have a courteous conversation with the agents. And my recommendation is don't accept the non-cash compensation. Make sure that if they offer you vouchers, if they offer you discounts, pass. But make sure you don't give up your rights to further compensation as a result of your refusal, but because it's important that you, in fact, have a view to further compensation. The process, send a letter to the airlines. You have to go through this process of communicating with the airline. You have to talk about putting together forms on the Air Canada Protection Rights website, the Air Passenger Protection website, and then the case will be opened by the Canadian Transportation Agency to look at it. Arbitration, adjudication, the whole process starts. There's mediation, there's discussion, there's dialogue, adjudication, mediation. It'll take a year for you to go through the whole process. In the meantime, you can come up with some offers of settlement, but you're looking at about a year to go through the process, so patience is going to be the key to making this thing work. So in summary, you've got regulations that purportedly look to help the passenger deal with situations where you have disruption. The Airline Deregulation Act that started 50 years ago was an experiment. And it was an experiment to see how well airlines behave in the world of free market travel. The experiment continues today. 50 years later, we're still talking about trying to figure out the extent to which airlines can, in fact, address the needs of the traveling public effectively. My view is that we're not done yet. There will be some more regulations showing up. This is just the start of a set of re-regulation in the industry. Re-regulation will, in fact, become much more prevalent when we talk about carriers that want to charge for using the lavatory. Not unheard of. Seat pitch, seat density on board airplanes. Those are issues that are going to be starting to come up in the next little while, and you'll see regulators starting to put their nose into some of those things that airlines are trying to do to differentiate themselves. So we are probably heading down the road to some type of re-regulation in the industry. May not touch the level of price, but it will definitely touch the level of service that we're being offered. With that, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Have a good day.